So when we decided to add a new character to Grimwood Hollow in 2021, our original idea was to create another creepy swamp witch crouching next to the cauldron. You can see in this quick sketch that she was still going to have a basket of baby imps and an animated arm dropping one into the cauldron. But then we thought, wouldn't it be way more fun to come up with a truly unique original character? And so the idea for the collector was born. The collector would be half spider and half gnome, which we called an arachnome. He would have multiple arms for collecting the baby imps and helping the witch with her potion. In this early sketch, he had antlers, which we eliminated, and only 3 arms instead of 4. We also added his rusty shears and the tree stump he's perched on. Next, I decided to do a quick 3D sketch in ZBrush to work out his design. This really helped to visualize what I was about to sculpt. So I gathered my head form, monument clay, plastic domes for the eyes, printed out some images for reference, and now it was time to sculpt. I heated up some clay in the microwave and started to trowel it on and build up some rough forms. With a tool, I sketch on some of the facial features and continue to block in the shapes. I carve out some sockets for the eyes and pop in some plastic domes, then continue to rough out its features. Then I stick on some super quick clay teeth and mandibles as placeholders to start to visualize this character. You can see it's already starting to shape up. All I was concentrating on at this time was its form and bone structure. Next, I start to rough in more of its facial features like wrinkles, eyelids, and eye bags, and continue to develop his form and anatomy. I also start scratching in more of his skin texture. Now it was time to add teeth. I heated up some thermoplastic beads in hot water to soften it up, and then shaped a bunch of different sized teeth. Once they were cooled and hardened, I carved out some tooth sockets and plugged them into the clay. A quick check of our reference, and I think it's starting to look pretty cool. With the overall form done, it was now time to really start defining the details. I begin to really develop the eye bags, the wrinkles, skin cracks and textures, nostrils, the lips, and all these details that make it look more fleshy and alive. You really want to punch in some of these details to create some good shadows. Here's a great tip. Use a small piece of rubber pond liner, which has a slightly abrasive texture, to smooth and rake out the clay. I wanted the top of the head to be smoother with less texture than the face for a nice contrast. Now it was time to sculpt his mandibles. First, I covered some armature wire with aluminum foil and coated it with 5-minute epoxy, which gives it strength and it helps the clay to stick to it. Once it was set up, I heated up some clay and started building up the sculpture. This was pretty simple. I just carved a general shape, added the barb-like teeth, and then carved some cracks and striations for texture. I did a quick check to make sure it fits, then I smoothed it out and cleaned it up with a brush and some rubbing alcohol. And here's the finished mandible sculpture. So now it's time to mold and cast them. First, a couple quick coats of matte spray. Then I mark the split line with a Sharpie because this will transfer into the silicone. Then I make my foam core mold box, mix up some silicone and dump it in, vacuum the silicone, open the mold after it's set up, split the mold on our Sharpie line, and pull out the sculpture. Now we cast them. I powder the mold, tape it closed with some masking tape, mix up some urethane, dump it in, and about 20 minutes later, we have our first mandible. Just pop it out. Pretty cool! The last step is just to trim the ends round so they fit in the sockets. And there's our mandibles. So now we can get rid of our placeholders, hog out the sockets, and get our new mandibles to fit. Looks like they are going to work great. And there they are. It's really starting to come together. So now it's time to clean up and refine all of the details. I use a brush and some rubbing alcohol to smooth it out, and my sculpting tools to dial in the texture and wrinkles. You'll notice I'm constantly switching back and forth between the brush and the sculpting tools to really clean it up and add these final details. Be careful not to use too much alcohol because it can turn your clay into sludge. Do most of your cleanup with the sculpting tools and then just soft final smoothing with the brush and alcohol. Now that the clay is smoothed and blended, it really starts to look nice and fleshy. Since this is a Halloween prop, I exaggerated the texture and wrinkles so that they would read really well. Always look at photos of animals and humans when you need reference for wrinkles and skin textures. Next, I popped out the teeth and numbered them so I knew how to put them back later. And then I cleaned up the tooth sockets and lips. I also cleaned up the edge of the sculpture. Next, I grabbed my texture stamps from Monster Makers, which are a great way to add some finishing touches to your sculpture. They have a number of great skin textures, and I use this one to add some subtle skin pores to the top of the head. I just press the stamp into the clay and then soften it gently with some rubbing alcohol and a brush. And the final step was to add our Grimwood Hollow stamp. I used these metal stamps, lightly dipped them in baby powder, and then stamped them into the clay. And here's the finished clay sculpture all cleaned up. Now I just have to pop the teeth back in so I can get some finished shots. I took this photo of how the teeth were arranged, and I had the teeth numbered so I knew what sockets they went to. And here it is, the finished collector head sculpture. I took a few shots indoors and outdoors so that there would be some different lighting on him. Remember, even though you are creating a fantasy character, the rules of anatomy and nature still always apply. And as I mentioned, this character was definitely influenced by a few different real-world creatures. It has multiple eyes like a spider, the mandibles of a beetle, lip bumps like a dog, scaly, cracked reptile skin on the cheeks, a nose like a bat, and a mouth inspired by an African tigerfish. Nature is always the best reference when designing a fantasy character or creature. Sometimes a mashup of different animal parts can create an entirely new species. It can also be really helpful and inspiring to look at creatures and monsters from movies, TV shows, or even your favorite YouTube artists. And now it was time to sculpt the feet. I did a mock-up photo in Procreate on my iPad, and this way I was able to scale and measure the sculptures. I sketched out the shape of the feet, made a quick foil armature, and hot glued it down. Then I heated up the clay and started to build up the form. I created a slight arc to the bottom of the feet so they would curl over the edge of the stump. Now that the basic form was done, I started to define the tendons, toes, and ankle bones. And here's the finished rough form. Now I can add and refine the details. So next I add some veins. I rolled up little thin worms of clay and laid them onto the foot sculpture in a vein-like pattern. Then I used this ball stylus tool to go around the veins and blend their edges into the foot. Next, I sculpt the skin texture over the veins to knock them down and blend them in a little more. And there you go, some nasty monster foot veins. So now I finished sculpting all the wrinkles and skin texture. And finally, I smooth out the sculpt with rubbing alcohol and refine the details. And the last step was adding the Grimwood Hollow stamp. And here's the finished collector feet sculptures. The clay toenails are just placeholders to help visualize the design, but we will be making the actual nails out of thermoplastic later. The design of these feet are pretty much based on human anatomy that I just tweaked and exaggerated into a 3-toed creature foot. Remember, when creating Halloween props, it helps to over-exaggerate textures and details, and even leaving them slightly crude and rough. This will pick up paint and shadows and read much better at night in a Halloween display. It's time to sculpt the hands. Once again, I used my mock-up photo in Procreate to scale the hands, and then I was able to build an armature to match. The hands are a symmetrical 3-fingered design so that one sculpture works for all 4 hands. Once again, I start building up the basic form and shape, and then quickly start carving in some of the details like wrinkles, texture, and the stretchy skin over the tendons. And once I had these details dialed in, I smoothed it out with some alcohol and refined the sculpture. Again, the clay nails are just placeholders, and we will make the real ones out of thermoplastic. And here's the final sculpt for the collector's hands. I gave it the same wrinkly textured skin so that it ties in with the look of the face and the feet. Even though it's a generic hand sculpt, I will be able to put armature wire into the fingers when I cast them, which will allow me to bend and pose each one of them in a unique way. When sculpting a creature that is going to be animated or posed, you always want to sculpt it in a neutral position based on its range of motion. I sculpted these fingers partially bent in a neutral pose so that it would minimize the squash and stretch of the latex rubber when bending and posing the hands. And finally, it was time to sculpt the ears. I started to rough out the shapes and match them up to a latex cast of the head to make sure they will fit. I wanted them to be pretty simple goblin or gnome-like ears. And here's the rough sculpture. Next, I traced them on a board. Then I carved out some small depressions in the back. I filled them with hot glue and attached them to the board. The hot glue melts into the clay and locks it on good enough to finish the sculpt. So then I dialed in the details and texture and cleaned them up with some rubbing alcohol. And here's the finished ears. Just some simple goblin-like ears with some subtle wrinkles and texture to blend in with the other sculptures. Well, there you have it. And now that all the sculptures are done, it's time to mold them. So stay tuned for our upcoming videos where we show you how to create hydrocal molds for latex and polyfoam castings. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon!